Hey, welcome back for another week of the IOGA, Idaho Outfitters and Guides Association podcast. In our original recording, the beginning got a little screwed up, so here's a fill in. But this is a great conversation. Jack and I talk about budgets, we talk about things we've been doing the last couple weeks, and then Jack has a great interview that you definitely want to stick around for. So if it feels like this just starts off a little strange, that's because it does, because the recording got screwed up. But here you go for the podcast. So I spent this last week in Florida, of all places, at the IPW convention, I think it is. Visit Idaho asked me to travel down there with them. It is this giant convention where states primarily and some municipalities like big cities and stuff set up booths to pitch international tour companies on why they should send, and travel agents, why they should send guests to their locations. And Idaho is really focusing on outdoor recreation and specifically like the 3100 and all of that. So they asked me to come down with them. And so I spent 3 days down in Florida, sitting down every day, all day with travel agents and big tour companies from Europe and really kind of all over the world who send folks here, specifically kind of the Northwest and to Idaho, or interested in sending people to Idaho and wanting to know what the opportunities are here, who they should talk to, all of that kind of stuff. And so I spent 3 days just talking about all the great outdoor recreation tours and opportunities that we have here. We talked a lot about jet boat rides and rafting trips and backcountry horse trips. And we had some great conversations with some folks from the UK about hunting outfitters. And they were really curious about all the hunting opportunities in Idaho. And so it was a lot of fun to kind of get to go be the person to talk about the outdoors in Idaho with folks from all over the world who want to send folks here. So
Yeah, sounds really fun.
it
How'd
was,
you like
yeah,
Florida?
Florida was not for me, man. It like, I got off the airplane and it was like running into a wall of heat and humidity. Freaking hot. So that part, yeah, I don't know how people live there, honestly, this time of year. It was wild. Just walking from like, there was like 3/4 of a mile from the hotel to the convention center. And, walking there at 9 in the morning and you get there and you're just like soaked. It felt like it was unpleasant, but it was great to go spend some time with folks from Visit Idaho and just really push outdoor recreation and specifically our outfitters to these big tour companies and travel agents. And I also didn't really have a good appreciation for how relevant travel agents still are in Europe. Like there's a lot of countries over there where 80% of travel is planned through travel agents because you get travel insurance through the travel agent. So if something goes sideways, like the travel agent is expected and legally obligated to fix it for you and stuff like that. And so people really travel through those services. So when we're pitching guided activities in Idaho and everything to those people, they really do send a lot of people. Like they have a lot of influence. It's not just finding stuff on the internet like we do here in the US. It's a very different sort of travel model and culture. Really
Yeah, I
interesting.
didn't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. As I was having these conversations, like, why are we talking to these people? Why does this matter? No one uses travel agents. And I got educated on why I was ignorant of reality by some folks. So it was good. And then another fun thing that just happened is I wrote an op-ed related to our sort of request to the Forest Service to investigate chainsaw use in the Frank, and that came out in the Statesman on Sunday. We had some really good feedback related to that, and so it's been kind of neat.
Yeah, it's a good op-ed. It's Eric, you did a good job. I think laying out more of the philosophical position on that. So I would suggest people read it and consider the points, because it is very helpful.
Well, thank you. All right. Well, Jack, let's move on to some updates. We're never going to get through all this. There's some stuff to
Yep.
talk about.
Yep. Got a lot to talk about today. Some of it a little in the weeds. Got some budgetary things.
Yeah. Jack's favorite.
But my favorite. I love it. First things first, Steve Pierce was officially confirmed to be the next director of the BLM. This has kind of been expected for a while. If you guys listened into the podcast last week or 2 weeks ago, we talked about his fake confirmation vote when the Senate actually just voted to move the vote forward. And then everyone thought that he had been confirmed. But now he's actually been confirmed. So he'll take the helm at the BLM and hopefully he makes good choices. A couple things I want to highlight. Idaho's senators, Mike Crapo and Jim Risch, Mike Crapo voted to confirm Steve Pierce. Interestingly enough, Jim Risch was not voting in that vote. So I think I said before it was a little bit of an awkward position for him given his very public stances on public lands, and he sat this one out. So he might have had a good place, another place he needed to be. Sometimes there's good reasons for that stuff, but that was interesting to see.
Yeah. Who knows what the reason he wasn't there. There's all sorts of scheduling issues that come up, but I'm with you. I found it just kind of interesting that he didn't happen to be around for that one.
Mm-hmm.
Is what it is. Yeah. So next on the list, USDA allocated $12 million for CWD research, management, and prevention. So, I don't think there's a whole lot to talk about here other than seeing this as a national priority is, I think, really important and valuable, and hopefully brings some money to Idaho in the work we're doing here, because compared to a lot of places, still in the location where we can try and stop the spread of this from taking off in a major way. There's some places where that ship has sailed, I think, and we're not there. And so hopefully this can be money that comes in to help us in our efforts here.
Yeah, with all the problems that our big game are having in Idaho, we really don't need to add this to the list. And so it's good to see that the USDA is starting to invest in that. I think about half of that is going towards farmed cervids, and the other half is going towards wild cervids. But also, honestly, I think that we could put more money into this because CWD research is a pretty pressing issue in my mind. So
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been talking about trail maintenance a lot lately, and this popped up this week, and Jack, you saw this, that Forest Service trail maintenance in 2025 was the lowest year. They cleared the lowest number, or maintained the lowest number of trail miles in the last 15 years. So the stat that was in the article was that agency maintained 22% fewer trail miles in 25 than in 2024. So that was pretty depressing thing to see. And, there was a lot going on last year, a lot of sort of Doge chaos, I think. So I think there's probably some very real and understandable reasons why this is a statistic that we're seeing. But, as we talk about trail maintenance and everything else, I don't know, that was a pretty sad number to see.
yeah, I mean, honestly, it's unacceptable to be failing to maintain that, and it really comes down to a staffing thing. A lot of the people that were doing that work were let go. The article talks a bit about how funding that was already approved was actually returned because there was just no one to do the job and get paid for it. So in a lot of cases, it's not a funding issue. It's just a personnel issue. So we really do need to staff these offices appropriately and get more boots on the ground.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, the share of trail miles meeting agency standards dropped 19%. Last year, some ranger districts lost 100% of their trail staff in 25. So it is you're right. It's some places it is a funding issue, but in some places it's just a staffing issue and maintaining staff and everything else. But I think it's an important sort of marker in our ongoing and what will be a long-term conversation around trails and trail maintenance. So
Yep. All right. Next
yeah,
on the list. Yeah, I'm going to dive deep into this one.
go.
So bear with me, folks. This might be a little in the weeds, a little bit long, but it's really important. Important but deeply unsexy, as Aaron would say. So the FY27 Interior Environment Appropriations bill is out. This is basically the House of Representatives laying out how they want to fund the federal government for next year. And this came out of Congressman Simpson's subcommittee. He's the chair of the subcommittee. He exercises a lot of power over the federal government and over federal land management agencies through the subcommittee. And so it's always really interesting to see what comes out of the markup. This bill still has, I want to disclaim this by saying the bill still has a long way to go. Still got to go through the full committee and get voted by both the House and the Senate. So there's probably a lot that will change, but this is what we're starting from. Okay, so first things first, Forest Service budget is staying roughly flat. It's slightly above the last couple years, at about 8.79 billion. A lot of that's going to wildfire, which is important, but also important is the non-fire budgets, which are staying roughly flat as well. So for folks that have been tracking the Forest Service really closely recently with the reorganization, you might have seen that the White House's budget request was to zero out Forest Service research as well as state and private and tribal forestry. Those accounts are being left in this bill, at least those accounts are being left whole. So Forest Service research, state, private, tribal forestry is still there, still funded at the same levels that it was in the past. A couple other things. It's similar funding levels for DOI, so BLM, and as well as NPS if you're a Park Service operator somewhere. The funding levels are staying roughly the same. There's some weird fire spending happening because they're trying to create this new wildland fire service that would merge some fire operations between agencies. So there's some fire money being moved around, but overall, the levels are fairly stable. Other funding things, Land and Water Conservation Fund. This has been a big priority for a lot of our kind of conservation friends. That was permanently authorized a few years ago, and this bill continues that and keeps funding levels about the same. It fully funds PILT. So if you live in a rural county in this state, a lot of your county's budget comes from PILT, which is payment in lieu of taxes. That's fully funded at about $650 million. So Idaho will get its share of that, which comes out to a little less than $50 million, I believe, in a given year. That's kind of the major budget items, but there's a lot of policy riders that go in here as well. So this bill prohibits any federal funds from being used to block hunting, fishing, or recreational shooting on federal lands where those uses were allowed as of January 1st, 2013. And there's some exceptions for public safety or for fire, stuff like that. But basically saying that, any state or federal agency that's getting federal funds cannot block, hunting, fishing, or shooting on federal lands where it's been done in the past, which I think as someone that cares about access, that's a win. There's some other restrictions, kind of preventing people from restricting hunting and fishing equipment on federal lands. And then we get into some of the endangered species stuff. So Mike Simpson cares a lot about bears, wolves, and other endangered species and how those are managed, and this bill reflects that. Section 128 of the bill prohibits any federal funds, from being used to establish an experimental grizzly bear population in the Bitterroot ecosystem of Montana and Idaho. So that overlaps with the Frank Church, Selway Bitterroot. We've heard from outfitters that were concerned about Fish and Wildlife bringing grizzlies, across from Montana into Idaho. This is going to make it basically impossible for them to do that. And, the grizzlies can walk across, obviously, but they won't be brought in by the agency. It also requires the Secretary of Interior to reissue the 2017 delisting rule for Yellowstone grizzlies. And this is not subject to judicial review. So basically, Congress would be trying to force the delisting of the greater Yellowstone grizzly. As far as wolves go, this also requires that Fish and Wildlife reissues the 2020 nationwide wolf delisting rule, also not subject to judicial review. Idaho's still managing its wolf population under state authority with Fish and Game, so this wouldn't necessarily have an immediate impact, but it's a pretty big signal, and I think would be a pretty big move in terms of wolf management for other states. Finally, we've seen some stuff about wolverines lately. Payette National Forest was just posting some pictures of wolverines that they'd spotted. This blocks implementation of the 2023 rule listing the wolverine as threatened. There's some folks out there that I think have been interested in wolverines, and how it might affect their operating plans. So this would basically prevent that, at least for fiscal year 27. All right. I know that's a lot to go through. There's a lot of other things in there having to do with the EPA, having to do with the Cottonwood legal decision, if anyone's familiar with that. But maybe that's something for another podcast. Maybe we can get Congressman Simpson on here to talk about it. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Eric, any questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think just one, it's worth saying this is very much a starting point, right? Like this almost certainly is not how this will end. when the time comes, but it is a good starting point. And my read on it is there's some things in here that we should be pretty thankful for as the outfitting industry, and there's some things that we should be keeping our eye on, or maybe aren't exactly where we'd like them. But overall, this feels like a pretty good starting point from the sake of Idaho outfitters. This feels pretty good.
Yeah, it's there's stuff in here that people will be upset about, but I would say by and large, it's kind of what you would expect from Mike Simpson. It's pretty balanced, pretty reasonable. Definitely reflects what a lot of Idahoans want to see. So
Yeah, that's great. That's a good. Yeah, it's great. So let's see. Yeah, Jack. I mean, is that kind of your main takeaway? Or where's the process go next from here? Do you know?
yeah, I think next it'll go into a full committee markup. And so the full committee will get a chance to talk about it, look at it, make changes. There will certainly be changes. I imagine some of the more controversial provisions in here around wolves, grizzlies, and the EPA will probably be changed or removed. We'll see where the committee goes with it. After that, committee votes it out. It kind of gets merged into the larger appropriations bill, and then it moves through the normal process on the House and Senate. And then, yeah.
Well, that's great. We will keep all of our IOGA listeners updated on how that process rolls forward. Yeah, again, to go back to talking about trails and everything else, it would be great to see a lot more money going to some of these agencies for some of that kind of work. But this is at least holding even, which is great. And, there's opportunities within the agencies themselves for some of those restructures and stuff. We may end up seeing more money on the land for those kinds of things, even within the overall big picture budget staying about the same. But good stuff. Good reporting, Jack. All right. On to upcoming IOGA announcements. So just a few coming up here. First is Big Water Blowout on June 6th in Riggins. Super fun event. Friday night's kind of guide night, guide hangout, and everything else going on. Saturday's the kind of big boating event. And then the Dutch oven cook-off. So great food, great time. It's open to the public. We have outfitters competing, members of the public competing in that. From a big water side of things, I think it's going to be more kind of a medium water blowout, probably. But in a lot of ways, that's actually more fun anyway. So if you're around on this side of the state around June 6th, you should get up there. It's a great party.
You gonna make it, Eric?
That is my plan as of today. There may be some other things that are going to pull me away, unfortunately, that I just found out about. But my hope is to be there. My heart is in Riggins the first Saturday of June every year, for sure. I love it down there doing that. It's a fun event. So a lot of great memories. And then IOGA member renewals are coming up on July 1st. So if you're a member of IOGA, you should expect to get a renewal packet coming here in the next couple weeks. And we look forward to folks getting their renewals done in a timely fashion so that we don't have to call you and ask or whatever.
And if you're a guide out there who is questioning whether or not you want to join IOGA, I would strongly encourage it. It's very much worth the cost because it's so cheap for a guide. And you help support all the work that we're doing here and this podcast and all of our stuff at the state legislature and in Congress. So, yeah, hit that subscribe button, as the kids say.
Yeah, well, in this case, it would be hit the join button.
Hit the join button.
Also subscribe, but then join. Become a member.
It's only $2 a month.
Yeah, it's $2 a month, or $202.50, or it's some minor amount. But more importantly, as we go and we talk about representing our membership and everything else. So the bigger those numbers are, the more I think powerful our voice is at the state house and at the federal level as well. So, all right, let's move on to our interview. So, Jack, any context you want to give folks before we dive in? Or you ready to go?
I would just say stick around to the end. It's not all about salmon. We got some pretty interesting and maybe very impactful discussion on smallmouth bass at the end that I hope folks will listen to as well.
Awesome. Well, here's the interview with Jay Hesse. The Idaho Outfitters and Guides Association relies on the support of our members. So thanks to everybody who's a member, but especially thanks to those who participate in our Dollars for Outdoors program, who go above and beyond making sure this organization can get out there and advocate for the industry and our public lands. Cascade Rafting Kayak, Mile High Outfitters, McGowan Outfitting, White Cloud Outfitters, Bear Valley, Rapid River Outfitters, Soar Northwest, Bighorn Outfitting, Mystic Saddle, and Table Mountain.
Yeah. Also, big shout out to our Dollars for Salmon supporters, folks whose money goes directly to support our work advocating for anadromous fish. So we have Rapid River Outfitters, SNS, Canyons, Solitude, and Salmon River Drifters. So if you're not already on that list, reach out, talk to me or Hardy or Eric, and we could kind of get you set up with DFO or DFS and help building this program that we're working on here.
Yep, it's a great way to support the efforts here at IOGA, especially our public land, our work in the public land space. Thanks to everybody who's a participant in these programs and everyone who's a member.
All right, Jay Hesse, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for coming on here.
Oh, you're welcome. It's my pleasure to be able to share a little bit about fishing the Snake Basin.
Yeah. So for folks who don't know you, do you mind kind of introducing yourself, kind of talk about what you do, give your story a little bit?
Sure. My name is Jay Hesse, and I am the Director of Biological Services for the Nez Perce Tribe and their Fisheries Department. I've had the honor of being employed by the Nez Perce Tribe for 32 years next month, so it's been a long haul. My current position for the tribe really focuses on two things, and it is hydro system operations and how those hydro operations impact fish real time and how they can be changed to lessen the impacts. And then second, how we can look at hydro system structure and function long term, kind of strategically, and try to align that with reestablishing healthy and harvestable or healthy and abundant salmon and steelhead stocks. So it is a lot of focus on hydro system operations, but I also work with status assessments, how well the fish are doing. Just numbers back, kind of the larger effort that the Nez Perce Tribe has for fish management, which is habitat restoration and research and hatchery production. I dabble a little bit in all of those, and it's integrating those is and communicating it from a technical science standpoint, which is my background, to policy makers and decision makers throughout the regions has been really a focus of mine over the last 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, that's got to be a big challenge. There's a lot of science and technical things to bring together and make compelling and interesting. And I think you're a pretty humble guy, Jay, but I think it's probably fair to say that you're probably one of the most knowledgeable people on the hydro system and lower Snake River anadromous fish in the world. So I'm pretty happy to have you here and get to pick your brain for a little bit. So first things first, we're kind of here to talk primarily about quasi-extinction thresholds and kind of what they are, what they mean. Do you mind giving a little explainer on those for folks that might not have a anadromous fisheries background or any kind of technical degree like myself?
Sure. I'm going to start big picture and the happier end of what we try to manage for, but I think that's important context for what the quasi-extinction thresholds are. So in a fish management or manager thought process, really we start with setting goals for what we would like to have for fish numbers coming back, and so trying to identify what the desired state is. So healthy and abundant fish stocks are what the tribe has help quantify in the region with our fisheries co-managers and others. And so that's kind of the target where we'd like to be. Rarely are we at that level, and so we've identified thresholds or levels of fish below that healthy and abundant that help guide our management structure. And unfortunately, a lot of that focuses on the Endangered Species Act for the stocks and species of fish throughout the Snake Basin that are central to Nez Perce tribal treaty rights and tribal culture. With that Endangered Species Act status are abundance thresholds necessary for delisting those. And so they're called minimum abundance thresholds. So it's really how many fish do you need to have on the landscape? There are other attributes that play into it, but abundance is one of them. And so a minimum abundance thresholds are at that level of trying to get above so that we can get away from Endangered Species Act delisting. The quasi-extinction thresholds are even below that minimum abundance threshold, and instead of a measure of success, it's really the criteria of failure. And it is a conservation biology term that is applied across different taxa of animals. And for fish species, and salmon and steelhead in particular here in the Columbia Basin, the quasi-extinction threshold has been defined by the National Marine Fisheries Service as 50 or fewer natural origin spawners occurring within a population in 4 consecutive years. So it'd be 50 or fewer natural origin fish in 1 year and 50 or fewer natural origin fish coming back the next year and repeated 2 more times. And so that being at that quasi-extinction threshold or QET level is not absolute extinction, but it is one where conservation biology says game's almost over. And if you have the ability to do any last-ditch efforts, you better try, because the persistence of that population into the future is highly uncertain. And so it's not a threshold to say when you start taking drastic actions. It's, boy, your hands are really tied and you should avoid this state at all possible costs.
So it's a backstop. So the threshold, is that tied to genetic diversity, or is it purely just a lack of an abundance?
Good question. It has a genetic component in it, but at that point, it is a numbers game. And it is so few fish that dispersing those fish over, and it is population specific. So it's not the entire Snake Basin. It is specific to each one of the population units within the Snake Basin. And currently there are 35 existing populations that still have fish in those. So if you think about a population unit on a spatial scale, you think of a drainage for spring summer Chinook like the Amnaha River in Northeast Oregon, or the Secesh River in central Idaho and a tributary to the South Fork salmon. Those are the spatial structures. So 50 or fewer natural origin fish returning to that type of spatial scale, fish just have a hard time finding their mate.
Right.
To reproduce with. The genetics, that level of fish coming back is well below the target for maintaining genetic diversity. And so the common assumption in reality is that genetic diversity has already been lost and compromised at that level. And so it's just trying to hang on to some of that genetic, the genome to carry forward.
I see. Okay. Yeah. See, I'd always thought it was tied more to a genetic component. But that makes sense. It's more just tied to the number of fish in the stream and, their ability to find each other and actually reproduce.
Correct.
Okay. Can you give us, a little bit of an overview, the trends for the Snake River right now? Like, what are we seeing salmon and steelhead wise? Are we up kind of over the last 5 years? Are we down? How are you thinking about that?
Yeah, so each one of these discussions, when you think about, fish numbers, has to be really species specific. And we can get into a lot of details and break that down by, each population within that species. So I try not to get into that level of detail, but I'll start with spring summer Chinook into the Snake Basin and as a whole. And so the spring summer Chinook that are coming back in that distribute to numerous populations, we typically quantify as they pass Lower Granite Dam. There's one extant population of spring summer Chinook downstream of Lower Granite Dam, and that's Cannon River. And it is very close to functional extirpation. So I'm just going to set that one aside. It doesn't add a whole lot numbers-wise to the basin, but for fish coming upstream of Lower Granite, over the last 5 years, natural origin fish have averaged right around 8,000 or 8,500 fish. Okay. In 2025, that number was actually up a little bit, and we just got these estimates in, but it was 10,031 fish is the estimate of natural origin fish over Lower Granite Dam last year. So 1,500 more fish than where we had been for the last couple of years is not a huge jump, but we'll take every one of those coming back. Keeping in mind that if I go back to that context of what healthy and abundance goals are, the goal that we have for fish at Lower Granite Dam for natural origin spring summer Chinook is 235,000. And we're at
that's what
10,
I was going to
000.
ask, right? 10,000. So just a tiny percent of where we need to be. Yeah.
So if we look at, how fish are changed, so low abundance over the last 5 years. Okay, 2022 falls within that spectrum of time frame, and that was the high point within the last 5 years, and there were 16,000 that returned in that year. So that was touted by a number of folks, and in particular media, when you're trying to put a happy spin, a positive aspect to that. That is, it's positive. When you were at 8,000, it doubles to 16,000. That's positive in some ways, right? But in the big picture, we're still at the bottom of the bucket. And so that context for adequacy is really important. So you take the little bumps, but those little bumps need to be sustained over time to get us towards our goals of healthy and abundant. And right now, we're really stuck at the bottom of the barrel.
Yeah. I definitely hear what you're saying. I think sometimes there's a lot of media attention on like one good season when it's coming after, 4, 5, 6 bad seasons before that.
Yep.
And that gets back to the, the shifting baseline syndrome that we always talk about.
Yep. Yeah. A good season, in terms of your ability to go out and harvest fish, might feel much better if twice as many fish came back one year compared to the year before, right? But if you've lost context of what 10 or 20 times that number of fish would mean for harvest opportunity and natural production ability, that is that shifting baseline syndrome. And it's common not only in natural resources management, but really all aspects of culture.
Absolutely. Okay, I do want to focus in on Middle Fork Chinook for a little bit. This has been obviously one of the more visible species out there in the basin, especially for people that aren't fishermen. The 10,000 people that go down the Middle Fork a year probably hear about them. Middle Fork Chinook spawning in Marsh Creek have been, used as a political tool to convert Congressman Simpson to the cause of salmon recovery. And there's also something I think is going to come up a lot in the next few months. I know there's some articles circulating about the state of Middle Fork Chinook. So how are they doing? How are Middle Fork salmon doing? What are the QETs looking like there? What do you say?
So if we look across the entire Snake Basin, there's 34 populations of Chinook that we have abundance estimates for. And those include ESA listed stocks and unlisted stocks. But out of those 34 populations, 7 of them in 2025 had 50 or fewer natural origin spawners. We're below that threshold for the quasi-extinction criteria, right? But just in 2025. That's 21% of the populations were below that really game over threshold. Out of those 7 populations, 3 of them are Middle Fork salmon populations, which is really concerning when we think about the quality of the habitat that exists in the Middle Fork. So those populations are Loon and Camas Creek, and then the Middle Fork lower main stem population, which is from Indian Creek downstream and including some of the smaller tributaries that enter the main channel along that way. So dire straits for those populations, and certainly indicating that some efforts are needed to increase survival of those stocks. When we look at the management options that we have for Middle Fork populations, the toolbox is much smaller than what we have for other populations. When we talk about management options for populations in Northeast Oregon, the Upper Grand Ronde, the first thing that comes to mind is habitat restoration, and we're doing a number of efforts there. Same thing in some of the South Fork Clearwater tributaries. But in the Middle Fork wilderness area, not totally untouched, but about as intact as you get. The biggest impact to salmon production and productivity within that system is really just the reduction in marine-derived nutrients that has occurred from the lower returns of salmon and steelhead over decades now. But the physical habitat is intact. So habitat restoration, other than increasing marine-derived nutrients, is really off the table. Sometimes in our management toolbox is how you use fish hatcheries, and they are identified as both a potential risk to restoration of salmon and steelhead if those hatcheries are not operated in a conservation mindset, so they can erode the genetic structure of native populations and changing those, especially if you're using non-endemic stocks or some selective breeding protocols.
Mm-hmm.
Hatcheries can also be a conservation tool and are commonly used as that in the Snake Basin now to boost populations and maintain genetic diversity. But the Middle Fork salmon has been identified as an exclusion zone, a sanctuary, if you will, to not apply that hatchery tool for fish management. And so it's really unique in the basin for a large area to continuously not have intentional hatchery releases. Overall in the Snake Basin, over half of the populations do not have hatchery programs. I think that's not commonly understood. So if you look at like the South Fork salmon population or basin, 2 of the 3 populations within that have hatchery, but the Seasash does not have a hatchery program. So overall, if you take that across the Snake Basin, half don't have hatchery programs, but the Middle Fork salmon and its 9 populations, which includes Chamberlain Basin, which is geographically separated, but it's included within that. No intentional hatchery releases as a whole. If you look at how harvest is managed, there's not been intentional or recreational harvest of spring summer Chinook since the 70s in there. And so in basin factors, there aren't a lot of those tools, right? So then we start looking out of basin and what those are. And hydro system has been identified as the largest, both direct and indirect impact to the Middle Fork salmon. And it's been identified not only for Middle Fork populations, but for all populations in the Snake Basin as breaching the 4 lower Snake dams is an essential part of the tools that we need to apply if we're going to get back to healthy and abundant. You have to do habitat restoration. You have to do hatchery smart, but you have to do something drastically different in the main stem migration corridor. Yeah, and that's really the only tool we have. Right? Yep. That suite is pretty limited for Middle Fork populations, and it's a pretty dire component. Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why, when you look at the distribution of those populations at or below 50 is why you have 3 of the 7 in the Middle Fork. It's because everything else is pretty intact, but we haven't applied the hatchery tool, which has benefited some of those other ones here.
Yeah. So with having almost half of the populations within that drainage below those thresholds, what are the implications for the long-term health of that river?
It is the reduction of salmon and steelhead coming back to the Middle Fork has drastically changed the ecosystem and the productivity of that, just from the lack of marine-derived nutrients coming back. When you think about tens of thousands of fish coming back annually and the amount of nutrients that have been detected, not only in the fish resources, not only in the riparian vegetation, but can be detected in the vegetation, all the way up to the ridge tops. So it is amazing how those nutrients get dispersed throughout the entire watershed and have been a function of how things grow, both animals and plants. And that has been greatly reduced. So restoring that type of connectivity is going to be really important for achieving healthy and abundant stocks and all of the associated flora and fauna that goes with that. It's just not about salmon and steelhead. It's about
Right.
the entire ecosystem.
Yeah. Which means if you're a big game hunter, it should be important to you as well.
That's correct.
The other question I had about the QETs, so, as a non-fish biologist, thinking about 3 out of 7 being below these quasi-extinction thresholds, does that carry with it an increased risk for other populations nearby? So, like if Balloon Creek is below the QET, does that mean that, Bear Valley Marsh, Big Creek, all these other creeks, are they necessarily affected by that?
They're operating kind of in their own productivity cycle, but they're all depressed. So while those are not currently below 50, a number of those have been below 50 in the last couple of years. But the return in 2025 at 10,000 fish versus the 8,500 from the previous year actually bumped up some of those populations above that 50 threshold. Regardless, if you look at the abundance of fish into any one of those, they're not at the minimum abundance threshold. So just by label, minimum abundance threshold seems to be pretty significant in my mind. And we're still well below that for all of those populations. And so there are impacts currently occurring. That's why they're on the Endangered Species Act and needing actions to bolster those up. The urgency from a tribal perspective and ecological perspective should be there, even if they're at 100 or 200 fish. Unfortunately, things have to be at such a dire state and below labels that catch people's attentions, like quasi-extinction thresholds, for it really to feel real in a lot of cases. And so 50 is really bad, and the risk goes up substantially when you drop below that QET threshold. But the risks are still very high when you're below the minimum abundance threshold as well, which is where all of those populations are at.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess what I hear you saying is we shouldn't necessarily get distracted by the QET as, the red light. It's more like the crashing train arm coming down to stop you from going over the railroad tracks. Correct. Whereas we've already blown through multiple stoplights on our way there.
That is correct. Great analogy.
Yep. Okay. So you mentioned that there's not a lot of levers that, fish biologists with the tribe and other places can pull right now. Are there things that are on the table now that, you might not have considered in the past because we are entering such a dire situation?
Yeah, great question. So the Nez Perce Tribe's been actively involved in trying to turn some of those big knobs, pull the levers that are going to make transformative change. How do you get restoration of the Lower Snake River and breaching of the 4 Lower Snake dams done in a way that works for fish and for local communities as well. So, how do we float all of those boats together, but to do it in a quick way for fish? Where we're at in those efforts is that it is not a pending decision. The discussions are happening that that's needed, but it's not likely that that action is going to take place in the next 5 to 10 years. So the tribe's efforts in some ways has not shifted in any way, but expanded to include the essential conservation actions to maintain that genetic resource into the future while we try to get those transformative changes done. So for Middle Fork populations specifically, we are in the mid and late 90s. We instituted a cryopreservation program, not only in Middle Fork populations, but throughout the Snake Basin, and where the Nez Perce Tribe went out and collected sperm from male salmon and cryogenically froze that in nitrogen and have it stored at the National Gene Plasm Repository in Fort Collins, Colorado. So those genetics from at least the male side of the genome are in storage. And so a little bit of that genetic reservoir uniqueness from the Middle Fork are preserved and potentially for use. We have secured 2 years of funding to do some extraordinary efforts to rejuvenate that effort and target stem cells of salmon. So we're going to go back into some of those Middle Fork tributaries and collect some juvenile fish and again, freeze some of the stem cells so that we have the full genome. And so this is worst case insurance policy, right? This is if the populations wink out, we at least have a tool that might be used in the future. Doesn't do anything for the fish now, but it maybe gives us an option in the future. We're also looking at ways to create a living gene bank for some of those populations. And so we're starting the planning and coordination process to start a hatchery program that is with Middle Fork genetic fish out of various populations, but dissociated from the Middle Fork itself. So not an integrated conservation program like we do in Johnson Creek or the South Fork salmon, but actually go in and collect some juveniles, take those down to a hatchery below the hydro system in the Portland area, rear those to adults, collect their eggs and sperm, and create a second generation from those, and then release those fish to go to the ocean, but to come back to that hatchery downstream of the hydro system gauntlet. So this would be a living gene bank, a hatchery program disassociated from its natural spawning habitat. So the risks of having that integrated, we're not looking to impact the genetic reserve and no hatchery zone that exists in the Middle Fork salmon, but really build that hatchery tool off-site, if you will,
Right.
to have for use if the Middle Fork populations totally wink out. That's an extreme measure. It is logistically complex. It is management. It has some questions from folks in terms of support, but it's a necessary. We're at extreme conditions, and those call for extreme measures, and we're trying to do that in a wise way that preserves options and doesn't add any additional risks.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. It's, I would say, as someone who's spent a lot of time on the Middle Fork and spent a lot of time talking about, the wild genetics of Middle Fork salmon, it makes me a little uncomfortable to think about, a Portland hatchery running its own genetic strain. But, I think it just shows how far we've gone. And just the dire circumstances that we're in now.
That's right.
And I hope, I'm glad that the tribe is doing that and putting resources into protecting those genetics because they are so precious. I also hope that image will maybe serve as a wake-up call for some of the decision makers that need to see just really how bad things have gotten.
Yeah. Well said. We're also pursuing another effort where the hatchery tool is used, but in a more shorter time frame. And so we're pursuing this in a pilot program to make sure that all of this works out, and it's boosting overwinter survival. So the basic concept is to go out and collect some par, so the juveniles in late summer, early fall, before the overwinter kind of bottleneck, if you will, or high mortality period occurs. Go out and collect some of those from a tributary, bring them into a hatchery, rear them in a relatively benign environment where your mortality will be next to nothing, but then take those juveniles back out to their natal tributary the following spring. So you're using natural origin fish. You're not altering or intervening in the reproductive cycle. You're just reducing the mortality during one segment of their life and then putting them back into their natural environment to complete their life cycle. So we're going to test that approach in some tributaries to Northeast Oregon and make sure all the numbers work out. But that is also a potential tool that we're thinking about applying to Middle Fork tributaries. So again, somewhat of a hatchery infrastructure tool, but not the genetic intervention of an artificial breeding program.
Yeah, and sounds like it would probably reduce, you always hear about the hatchery smolts or the hatchery fish hitting the water and not knowing how to really handle a moving river. It sounds like it would reduce those effects as well.
Yep.
With something like that in the Frank, I'm assuming they would have to be helicoptered in or hiked in.
Depending on where you do it. So if you pick a select few streams, Marsh Creek is something that you still have road access to. So,
right.
Logistically, handling and moving fish is difficult, and we need to take care of, so you have to do this in a demographic. You have to have enough number of fish. So hiking them in really doesn't work. Hiking them out and back in isn't going to be that. There's going to be some sort of mechanical connection to pulling that off in the numbers that have to be done. Like I said, we're going to pilot study that in areas that are less complex logistics wise, and then consider pursuing that in the Middle Fork salmon trips.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. You guys you're certainly getting creative with it.
The other aspect that we're looking to jumpstart is focusing on that marine-derived nutrient bottleneck. And so, again, we've got 2 years of funding to look at shad as a surrogate for salmon carcasses. So non-native species to the Columbia Basin coming back in the millions. And the opportunity, so it is an anadromous fish like a salmon, but not a salmon itself. So we've got some homework that we're going to do in controlled lab studies to check the nutrient composition of those fish for suitability to be a surrogate for salmon carcasses and marine-derived nutrients. We're going to check those shad carcasses for pathology risk and how to handle a carcass from one place and putting it into tributary habitats. We don't want to be the vector for any nasty bugs within that. And there's a question about how, if there's a risk with shad and disrupting the thiamase cycle within salmon production. So herring can disrupt thiamine processing within salmon populations and impact reproductive success. So we need to make sure that using a herring-like fish will not introduce that complexity and decrease salmon reproduction. So once we have those three things figured out in a lab setting, then we'll look, assuming those all play out in a manageable way, we're looking at using that abundance of shad and intentionally removing them from the lower Columbia or lower Snake, and outplanting those into specific tributaries, which could include Middle Fork salmon tributaries in some way. Extreme measure, but how you start. It's a chicken and egg thing in terms of productivity. How do you get more salmon back if they're if they're the nutrient engine, but there's a limiting factor of nutrients. And so it's one of the things of looking at what options we have available, but doing that in a very intentional way to make sure that we're not harming things along the way.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure if you could do that successfully, there'd probably be a whole suite of kind of knock-on effects for the native trout and other species, I'm assuming.
Very much so. Yeah.
So bigger cutties. And that's been done kind of around the Stanley Basin area, right? But I think other agencies have kind of done that around Redfish Lake, or maybe I'm wrong.
So nutrient enhancement for salmon is not a new concept. It was targeted in the mid 90s with studies done by the National Marine Fisheries Service. It was done with analog, so this processed kind of compressed, almost like a fire log that was put into streams. But at a very small scale. The studies that were done showed a response at a very micro habitat level that was positive. But to do it at the ecological scale has not been done. And so that's where the analog, doing this at a scale that makes a difference, is really the next concept. Nutrient enhancement in another form has been done with sockeye and fertilizing the natal lakes to get the primary and secondary production that those sockeye feed on to a robust level. But that's a different, functionally it's the same thing. It'd be similar to having sockeye carcasses in the thousands return to Redfish Lake and be out there. But without that, how do you boost zooplankton production in those systems? And so it's really a fertilizing effort in that case.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I have a couple other questions on a slightly different topic that I want to ask you. But before I do that, is there anything else that you want to say about QETs, Snake River salmon, steelhead, the Middle Fork, anything like that?
Yeah. I'll just highlight that, the message and numbers that we talked about for spring, summer Chinook are similar for steelhead. That not quite as extreme, but still a number of those populations are below the QET level. So, and not headed in the right direction. Both for steelhead and Chinook, having improved freshwater survival, whether that's increased productivity from more marine-derived nutrients, better direct survival through the hydro system, from less impacts from dams, less stress going through the hydro system from having faster travel times, either because fewer dams or better water flow or being spilled over the dams, has a carryover effect in terms of ocean survival in a positive way. So everything that you can do in the freshwater has benefits not only there, but later in their life. That being said, the ocean environment has not been really good for salmon and steelhead in lake. And the current predictions coming out of NOAA right now is that they're predicting an El Nino year and potentially the worst El Nino, on record, or, in 100 years or more. That means, basically hot water in the ocean. And really complex on how the ocean works. And so there's some uncertainty in that. But for steelhead, those fish, when they hit the ocean, tend to go to the open ocean and are impacted by the hot sea surface temperatures. So it's not as much of the upwelling conditions and the cold water that produces phytoplankton blooms near shore that are really beneficial to Chinook and coho. Steelhead are more impacted by those open ocean water temperatures. And the blob that was referenced in the news a few years ago is likely to be back in fury this year, and that's not good for steelhead.
Right. Yeah. I've heard about that a little bit. And, I've also been reading, I think they're forecasting more heat domes over the Pacific Northwest, which, regardless of ocean conditions, is going to make in-river survival drop off in a lot of places, I'm sure.
That's correct.
Do you think we just got an injunction from the court basically ordering more spill over the lower Snake dams? Are you optimistic about that? Is that a good, at least, Band-Aid, kind of give us a little more runway on some of these populations?
It is a step in the right direction and helpful. In many ways, that injunctive order maintained the spill operations and slightly improved them for the spring migrants. So the spring summer Chinook, the steelhead, the coho, the sockeye going out, that had been in place under agreement between some of the state and tribes and the U.S. government that was terminated in 2023. So that court order maintained and improved a little bit on those spring conditions. That court order improved migration and fish going downstream during the summertime and during the fall and winter, which certainly will have some benefits for fall Chinook in those time frames. What that court order doesn't do, and it's an injunctive order, so what it didn't do was alter the elevations in the reservoirs. And so how fast the water and subsequently how fast those juvenile fish get to the ocean because of reduced water volumes was not improved. And there's much to be gained there in terms of fish. So more to be done, both in terms of opportunities with the dams in, and more to be done to achieve adequate outcomes for fish. So what is in place now in all of the modeling says it's better but not adequate. Okay. And so a good thing to be positive but not satisfied with, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Small steps.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm going to pivot just a little bit, and I know you got to run soon, so I'll let you go. But you were just in salmon recently, gave a great presentation on salmon and steelhead and the lower snake dams and those conditions. But one thing that came up at the end of your presentation was water conditions on the lower salmon, particularly levels of methylmercury in that watershed, and kind of the effects that they have on some of the fish that people like to eat down there, particularly smallmouth bass. Do you mind just giving a quick rundown of that issue? Because we have a lot of folks operating down there. I've been a guide on the lower salmon, and we used to eat smallmouth all the time. So I'd love to know a bit more about that personally.
Yeah. So toxin burden within fish is unfortunately a reality in fish management and an important thing for anglers to be aware of. Fish has a whole bunch of health benefits from a dietary standpoint, but in the world today, fish also carry or can carry some type of toxin burden that is detrimental or risky to human health. In the Snake Basin, methylmercury has been identified as a toxin in fish species at a level that has triggered consumption advisories for smallmouth bass statewide. And so there's that blanket advisory across the state. And I believe some folks should go look at this and double check, but I believe that advisory is for to limit meals for women of childbearing age or children, so kids 15 years or younger, to 2 meals of bass per month, and that's it. For others, I think it suggests it to limit to 8 meals per month of those or less. And so that's assuming that that's your only exposure to methylmercury. So if you're eating other types of fish, and particularly ocean species, tuna and swordfish that are higher levels, then you have to kind of think about what your entire diet is. A recent study where the data has not, the results are just about to be released, but I'll highlight it here, did look at the methylmercury burden in fish species throughout the lower Salmon River and its tributaries all the way up to the East Fork Salmon River or Middle Fork tributaries as well. What we discovered is that the methylmercury burden in smallmouth bass in particular is at the highest levels observed in the state and equal to some of the levels observed in the Hells Canyon complex, where we know that we have a methylmercury problem because of the anoxic reservoirs of the Hells Canyon complex. What I would highlight for folks that spend time and consume bass is that methylmercury burden gets higher the bigger the fish is. And so once you get to those fish that are 12 inches or bigger, that recommendation for fish consumption advisories should be even more extreme. And so, the bigger the fish, the more exposure you're going to have to methylmercury. So it's not all fish are the same. So if you're going to be eating the stuff, target the smaller fish. Methylmercury is unique in the toxin world that it binds to the muscle and protein. It's different than PCBs and DDT and dioxins that are lipophilic or attached to fat. So there's lots of cleaning protocols for how do you clean a salmon to avoid your exposure to toxins. Take the bloodline out. Don't eat the belly meat. Those are the high fat areas that really minimize or reduce your exposure to toxins when eating salmon and steelhead. But methylmercury is different, that it's right in the flesh that you consume. So you really can't trim that out. And so it's really one of awareness. And then, if you are going to have the opportunity to catch and want to consume some of those fish, maybe intentionally eat a few more small ones rather than one big one.
Yeah. All right. That's really good information. I think there's definitely been a perception that the lower salmon didn't have the same water quality issues as Hell's Canyon, but looks like that might not be the case anymore. So
that's what it appears to be. We're just getting that information, and we'll be looking to get that out and share. But it's a head scratcher for us, and one that we'll be looking into. I think for now, folks being aware that there is that risk vector and to manage that accordingly while we try to figure it out, as in a management world of how to take that risk away.
Yep. So dinks only. All right.
On just that same nexus, it's just not smallmouth bass, but that's the one that people consume the most. But it's this risk was originally identified for tribal members potentially consuming sturgeon. Within that, that's a treaty resource with some consumption. And so in 2015, through some studies, we identified the high toxin levels and carrying of methylmercury within sturgeon. And the Nez Perce Tribe passed a consumption moratorium for its tribal membership. For the rest of the world, sturgeon is catch and release in that area, but for tribal members, up until that point, it's a treaty resource that was consumed. And so, in an effort to protect tribal member health, the tribe enacted that restriction of a treaty resource for consumption. And so we're actively trying to figure out ways to reduce that exposure and accumulation of methylmercury in sturgeon. I think figuring that out for sturgeon will have the same benefits for smallmouth. Smallmouth are a non-native species, a predator on salmon and steelhead, something that we don't want around in the landscape generally, but be mindful that there's a risk for consuming.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming on here, Jay. It's super informative and well spoken as always. Anything else I didn't ask you about that I should have?
Water temperatures. I just beware that super low flows. You're aware of this as guides and being on the water and closer to this. So hot water is rough on fish, both the resident fish that are there all the time and then the anadromous fish that are, either rearing as juveniles or coming back as adults. And so be mindful of that when angling and recreating in terms of additionally stressing those fish. So low flows, hot water likely given the climate and weather patterns that we're predicting. I think you guys are on top of that. But one of the things that is a base within our tribal management is just respect the water. And that really is meant in a broad sense, and respecting not only the water for what it is and supports in human and fish life, but also respecting the critters that are in that. And then for you all that spend time on the water, respecting the water because of the risks and the power that it has, just in a safety standpoint. So, my well wishes. It's an amazing spot to live. People should maximize their time on the water. It's sacred to the tribe and very special to the rest of us.
Yeah. Those are wise words to end on, and good reminder to bring like a water thermometer with you when you're out fishing with guests and turn it off when it gets too hot.
Yeah. Citizen science, this is a bit of a rabbit trail, but citizen science is a really intriguing aspect. And as people become not only present in hard to get places like the wilderness, but even in common day places, direct observations and pictures, and sharing that with management officials, your local fish and game folks and water quality people is really value added. Don't assume that there's eyes on the ground and monitoring programs in all of those places. So as you're recreating and enjoying those spots, take some notes. Be mindful. If you see a fish kill, just don't assume that it's been reported. Make sure that that information is shared and anything of that. So I am the value of observations from a broad community is really powerful, and engage not only you but your full community in that as well.
Yeah, that's really good to know, I think, especially if you're seeing something unusual out there this summer. Pass it along to Jay or your local fish and game officer, or yeah. All right, man. Well, thanks so much for coming on the podcast again. Hopefully you'll get the chance to connect over some of these things as you guys move forward in the conservation space, Middle Fork and everything. But until then, thanks so much.
Cheers. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for listening to today's conversation. Most of all, thanks to Jay Hesse for joining us and just spending some time talking with Jack about all the work that he's doing. And thanks to all the outfitters and guides in Idaho who are in the field working hard, clearing trails, getting people on the river, getting folks out, and helping them fall in love with the state of Idaho. Please reach out with any questions, comments, or suggestions you have for future episodes. If you like this episode, subscribe, tell your guide, outfitter friends. But most importantly, if you're not a member of IOGA, please consider joining. It's the support of our members that allows us to continue our efforts advocating for this community. Have fun out there, get out, enjoy the nice weather, get on the river, get in the mountains, and we will see you back here next week. No funny comments from Jack at the end?
See you later.
There we go.